Welcome, everyone, to another Voices with Vervaeke. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm welcoming Brooke Sprowl to talk with me. She reached out to me a while ago and, with a very interesting email. I was I found it very exciting. She was talking about her work and some of her past and how it overlaps in similarities with some of my work and my past. And so we had a conversation off camera, and I found it really exciting. So I said to Brooke, why don't you come on and let's do Voices with Vervaeke? Because I'm sure lots of people will learn and benefit from hearing what you have to say. So welcome, Brooke.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here.
So why don't you tell us, a little bit about yourself? Where are you coming from? How did you get to where you are? What's your work now? How do you see it interacting with my work, etc.?
Absolutely. So I'm a clinical psychotherapist. I have a neuroscience undergraduate degree, a master's in clinical social work with a mental health specialization from UCLA. And I've spent the last 15 years working with anxiety, nervous system regulation, trauma, psychodynamic, somatic work with individuals, couples, and families. And there's a natural extension from the kind of shadow work and this kind of nervous system regulation work into the spiritual realm, I
Mm,
think. And it's just sort of a natural developmental stage from in my experience. And so, like you, I grew up in a conservative Christian home where I had these really genuine encounters with spirituality. And yet it was coupled with this oppressive,
mm, yeah, yeah,
culture that
yeah.
really is at odds with authentic spirituality. So it created such this deep conflict within me because on the one hand, I was encountering something really powerful and real that felt true to my soul. And on
Mm,
the other hand, I was having these experiences where I felt like I had to be in this warlike relationship with myself. And now as I look back, I can see that, I was taught to disown and dishonor my intuition. That's the flesh. Don't believe, don't trust your flesh, trust the word of God. And so I was constantly kind of intellectualizing and trying to, coercively suppress my inner wisdom, which, now I would say is really the contact point with in an authentic spirituality or an authentic connection with source or the world or life or the universe, however you want to say it. And so, it was such a deeply painful experience, and it took me a long time
mm,
to come back to a new kind of spirituality that's not dogmatic, but that still feels really real and rich and a part of my daily life. And so that feels like a real intersection with your work. And your
mm,
work has also really facilitated that process for me, in that, as I've been seeking and, this kind of new way of relating to source, kind of encountering your work and seeing that there is a there, that, that I don't have to kind of write off my experiences with spirituality. It really gave me some permission and validation to
mm.
continue exploring the inner process that I've been engaged in, I think, for probably my entire life, consciously and unconsciously.
Yeah, yeah. So wow, yeah, lots of convergence. A couple questions come to mind. Um, One, do you feel that that when you were in that, and this isn't just a professional question, this is also like, I mean, personal in that it reflects back on me and my own attempts to understand things. So I'm sort of asking for your help, not just for an answer. Um, do you think that framework, that conservative Christian framework, do you think it was in any way affording your spirituality, or was your spirituality in spite of it? I understand that there was a tension there, but did it also afford the birth of a spiritual taste?
I think it absolutely did. And
Right.
that's what's such a mind fuck about
Yeah,
it.
yes, exactly. Exactly.
that's
Exactly.
what's that's what's so that's how they get you, because there is a real thing that's happening in the
Yeah.
church. I
Yeah.
mean, you go and you're just awash with this
Yeah.
spiritual presence, of community, of worship, of um kind of this experience with the divine and with, parts of our consciousness that aren't ordinarily accessible.
Yeah.
And yet, and so then, and that's also, as I've come to sort of see more recently, and I'm not by any stretch an expert in these things, but that's also part of the kind of political indoctrination and radicalization in a
Hmm.
way,
Yeah, I agree.
which
I agree.
is really, I'd never sort of thought about that component until very recently. Like,
Mm.
oh wow, this actually, there's some kind of a purposeful, um, you know, orchestration of that is in service of some somewhat nefarious, ends, in my opinion. But
Yes.
that's a little bit outside the scope of my expertise, so I don't want to dive too deep there.
No, no, I agree with what you said, but I won't drag you into that area of discussion. The one I want to follow up on what you just said about how, it's this double-edged sword kind of thing. Did you go through a period where you sort of, I went through a period where I became very atheistic, militant. I wanted to just have nothing to do with any of that. And then it took a lot of work and therapy and an ecology of practices and discussion, some very good discussions with good faith Christians, to ameliorate that and open me back up. Did you go through a similar phase where you sort of locked against the spiritual, or did it always stay active for you?
I did, to some extent. I wouldn't have probably called myself an atheist. I probably would have called myself agnostic for a long
Mm,
time.
right.
And but there were a lot of days of nihilism and just like, it's all
Yes.
meaningless, it's all
Yes.
material,
Yeah.
it's all, and but that, there was some part of me that couldn't fully rationalize. I don't know if you're familiar with GK Chesterton's work, but
Just a little tiny bit.
you should read Orthodoxy. It's a really marvelous work, and it touches on a lot. But I wish I could sort of capture the sentiment of what he writes. But he kind of says, how could the entire universe be less meaningful than sort of, our daily encounters, in the
Yeah. Yeah.
supermarket,
Yeah. Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
way. And so there's just a way in which it's like, it doesn't make any sense that we have this experience, this human experience, with beauty, with meaning, with connection, and that somehow the entire universe is completely meaningless
Right.
and
Right.
has, amounts to nothing. Like, that just, it just doesn't make sense that the sum of the parts is greater than the entire system,
Right.
or
Right.
the parts rather, not the sum.
I knew what you meant. Um, was there a single experience that sort of opened you back up to the spiritual, or was it a more of an incremental progression?
So I would say a little bit of both. I would
Mm.
say there were, a series of, there was an incremental progression of becoming more connected spiritually and more trusting.
Mm.
And your work was one of the facilitative steps, or aspects of that journey. I there, but there, I've had some really powerful altered states of consciousness,
Right. Right.
and not, I've never used psychedelics. I
Yes.
just have a mind that sort of naturally finds that kind of
Yeah.
state of consciousness through various means, not necessarily even practices. Yes, through practices, but that's not the only way that I've encountered those things. And yeah, I had almost an experience of like how people describe ayahuasca or
Yeah.
psychedelics.
Yeah.
I actually think I was taking a supplement that just did some weird things to my to my body that I don't think it was supposed to do. And wow, that was really solidifying. Like, you hear the studies that people really kind of, in the long term, change their entire belief
Yes.
system after
Yes.
having experiences with psychedelics. And in a way, that experience, I wouldn't say changed my belief system, because I was already kind of exploring that path and going down that road, but it really solidified a confidence or a trust, in the noetic.
So was the experience like an experience of profound oneness, or
It was
what?
a lot of things. It was
Uh,
profound oneness. It was kind of time doing some really interesting things. It was
ah,
speeding up,
right.
slowing down. It was feeling like I was in touch with like every possibility and every dimension and
Right.
every experience I
Right.
could have.
Yeah.
It was like it was like I could see the meaning in every material object. Like, a
Mm.
thing of cellophane. I could see all of the symbolic,
Yeah.
the meanings of like what this object kind of signifies from a almost, I don't know if platonic is the right idea there, but like in this like really grand existential way, it was like every object had this incredible significance. And it's like,
Yeah.
it's that experience that you hear, it feels more real
Yes.
than it feels. You have these experiences where you go, oh, this is the dream, the other one's the real place.
Yes.
And
Yes.
if you
Yes.
haven't experienced that, I think it's really hard to trust or understand that.
I think that's true. Yeah, I had the phrase, everything is singing its own name. That's how I experienced that, right?
Beautiful,
Um,
beautiful. Yes.
yeah,
That reminds me of a beautiful poem, I want to say by Lord Byron. It's like, gosh, it talks about the kind of selves goes itself, myself, it sings and spells. What I do is me, and for that I came. It's
mm.
just a beautiful, I can't remember the entire passage, but I'll send it to you later.
Well, you captured its spirit, that's for sure. So this is going on, and I'm really sort of humbled that my work helped you in this process. And you're having these, I mean, it sounds like higher states of consciousness that are and they're calling you to the really real and transformative experiences. But then you also sort of indicated that um, your psychotherapeutic work, especially shadow work, was also drawing you back towards the spiritual. Could you do a little bit more about that branch and then how they came together and how they reinforced each other? Does that make sense as a request?
Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely. So I believe that, you know, genuine transformation is an iterative process that's
Yes.
lifelong and ongoing and never ends. Like there's no bottom, right?
Yeah.
And so it feels like as we heal, our individual kind of personal gravity, our, baggage, however you want to frame it, our psychodynamic wounds, we reconnect with our most essential self. And we also heal our intuition and our sense of self trust. And it feels to me as though a real relationship with source requires some degree of connection with our own inner knowing and intuition. It
Mm-hmm.
feels like that's the contact point, as I mentioned earlier. And so the healing of, past trauma, past wounds feels like it naturally restores the connection with your own inner wisdom. And that parlays into this relationship that you develop with life and this ability to discern orchestration in a way, because that's one of the most profound sort of experiences that I have kind of in a non-altered state, just in a daily way of relating spiritually, is a feeling that everything is orchestrated.
Mm,
But I also believe that that is very much related to our character and our integrity. And
mm,
that's kind of the foundation of the work that I've done with emergence theory and that framework that I've sent to you. It's like, because there's a way in which you can't trust life if you can't trust your own character, and you can't trust yourself, and you can't trust yourself to show up and
mm,
learn and be changed by what you encounter. If your character is not intact, if you're not open to being changed and transformed and kind of dying and being reborn on a, in some ways, daily basis sometimes,
mm.
um I don't think that you experience that sense of orchestration and that sense of faith. Does that make sense?
It does, but I want to zero in on some of the key terms.
Mhm.
So you've indicated um, a trust in the self, but what you termed the essential self, and then you've also talked about, the really real giving you ability to trust the world, and that these two trusts are sort of resonating with each other or reinforcing each other in some way. You're nodding, so I think I'm on the right track at least.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. Conversely, if you don't trust yourself, it's really hard to trust life, you know?
Yes.
So
Is the reverse also the case? If you can't trust the
yes,
world, you also can't trust yourself?
I think so. I mean, I think those things aren't separate in a
Ah,
way.
right, 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 right. And that's what you mean by the contact point? The fact
Well,
that those two aren't separate?
that's interesting. I don't know if that's what I meant, but that might not be untrue.
Okay.
um, what I was referring to was, yeah, the intuition is the contact point, and so yes, I guess that makes sense. That the trust in self and trust in life, that the the
yeah,
intuition would be the kind of, what's the word in the nut in carpentry,
oh yeah, yeah, right,
schools,
right, right,
the I can't remember what it's called, but the little the little thing that would connect the two
right,
pieces.
right.
Yeah.
The nut for the bolts.
Yes.
Um, so what do you mean by that very pregnant term, trust?
Hmm.
Take your time with that too, because I know it's
Hmm.
important.
I think it's a sense of being held in a way, a sense of knowing it's that it's going to be okay, that even the thing you fear the most is actually going to in some way serve your highest potential and actualization, that everything in life is, I don't know, there's a quote in Life of Pi that said, the whole of life is one big let go. And I
Yeah.
think there's a way in which, the things that we most fear actually strip us of our defenses, our, ego identification, and that reveals a truer, and more essential self.
So is there an important dimension of like encouragement? It gives you a kind of courage in the face. I mean, I don't think of courage as just sort of bravado. I mean, it's the ability to not be have your vision distorted by fear, right?
Right. I think so. Yeah, I think there's just faith, that there's hope, there's encouragement. I mean, it reminds me of the Bible verse, we can trust that all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. It's like when your character is kind of, mm, let me define character. Character, I think, is the meta process we use to encounter the set of experiences we face in life,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so that process, repeats. Process always repeats, right? If it's a meta process. So it's like if you could actually hone the process in such a way that that you're going to become be improved by the struggles that you face,
Hmm.
then there's a way in which you can trust whatever happens will benefit you. Does that make sense?
It does, but I want to make sure that because I hear an implicit distinction and I want to explicate it and see if that lands for you. You're not saying that trust is that everything will turn out the way you want it to, or that you won't make mistakes, or you won't screw up, or any of that sort of magical thinking. What you're saying is you've got a contact with an inner and outer reality that affords you to be able to realize the good in whatever happens. Is that a better
Yes.
way of putting it?
Really well said. Yes.
Right. Right. Because that sense of trust and the love of the good, the Platonic love of the good, I completely understand that. That's a difficult one to get to, don't you think, in our culture? Because we mask it with bravado or certainty or willful assertion. I mean, I grew up, that's what the word faith meant. It meant all of
Ooh,
those things. It meant I just assert this regardless, willful assertion, or I just know I'm absolutely certain because I can't.
denial.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's all that stuff. Or even the Cartesian quest to trying to get indubitable truths that would be the inerrant foundation of all knowledge. And I think all of those have been very mistaken projects in a deep way.
Yeah.
So does part of your work, and of course I don't want you to violate any confidentialities or anything, but does part of your work involve uh, getting people to recover that kind of entrustment?
Yeah, I think that's essential to every stage of the work.
Ah,
But it just, at first, it doesn't necessarily, the person isn't necessarily aware of it as a spiritual process. But I find that as time goes on, the spiritual dimension starts to open up for a lot of people just naturally. But it always starts with a recovery of the intuition, because it feels like trauma really is, you know, teaching a big part of what is traumatic and what alienates us from ourselves, and others really, is being taught that our sense of things is wrong. We can't trust ourselves. Our way of being is wrong. So something essential about intuition to the healing process.
okay, so there's two more words that I really want to unpack, and because this has been really successful so far with you, I'm really enjoying the momentum that's building. So I get that you said something like it starts out therapeutically. People are wounded and they're healing, therapy, healing, right? But then it becomes spiritual. So what is that difference? What's the difference from a therapeutic transformation and a spiritual transformation?
Yeah, I would say it's from a sort of framework perspective, I would call it traditional psychology versus more optimal or spiritual psychology, right? Positive
Yeah.
psychology. It's like it's a continuum, and the continuum of traditional psychotherapy is, you're unwell, you're struggling, you're unhappy, you're not functioning at even kind of a baseline potential, so you're anxious, you're depressed, you have trauma symptoms, and then you go from that to just well and okay. And then the positive or optimal psychology or the spiritual
Ah,
component is like, okay, now I'm well, and now I'm really developing, I'm mastering my intuitive sense. I'm really getting a lot of discernment around my inner life, and therefore I'm more just clear and able to make contact with this kind of spiritual consciousness that's in the world.
I see. So, yeah. So when sort of, I remember Freud's famous quote of the job of psychoanalysis was to return people to their state of the normal state of unhappiness.
That's
Uh,
so depressing. I don't agree with that at all.
and then one of the courses I teach has a component on positive psychology. We actually teach a course on positive psychology at U of T, and then I think the way I talk about it is the positive framework and the pathological framework. The pathological framework says basically we understand the mind by how it breaks down and how we can get it back and working again. And there's truth to that. There's genuine truth to that. But the positive framework says, yes, but there are important properties and powers of the mind that are only disclosed when it excels beyond the normal. And you also
Right.
have to get that pole if you want a more complete understanding, even a more complete self-understanding. Does that land for you?
Absolutely. And what's interesting is that, yes, there's a pathologizing in on the kind of traditional psychotherapy, spectrum, but the healing in that is to depathologize, is to
Yes.
normalize, is to say, well, of course you're feeling anxious. Here are all the reasons that you're feeling anxious. You're not broken. This isn't an individual problem where you're sick and you're wrong. There's actually a system that has created this,
Ah,
and it's not you, it's not intrinsic to you. So we say you feel broken, you're experiencing brokenness. That's not that's a true experience you're having, but it's ego dystonic, it's not ego syntonic, right? It's different from, it's outside of you in a way. And
mm,
so that's a huge part in my experience of my own healing, is going, oh wow, here are all the reasons I was feeling alienated from myself. That's not my fault. That's not something in me. It's something that I was really in some ways indoctrinated into. And
mm.
there's just a program that, and this was one of the helpful aspects of your work for me, that continues to be a really rich part of my understanding of myself in the world, is really understanding frame,
Ah,
like
yes, yes, yes.
when I just think about this all the time. It has completely shifted my view of the world and many different topics. But when you said, the frame is, you don't see the frame, you see through the frame. And
Yes,
so I've just become very aware of how even our culture, culture, for example, is invisible to us. It's a frame, it's normal.
yes,
It's
yeah,
like you go to another, you don't realize what your culture is until you go to another culture and you
yeah,
realize not everyone lives this way. And
yeah,
so I've become really aware of American culture. And I guess, I don't know Canadian culture as well, but I think there's a lot of overlap.
yeah.
Um, in terms of the just high value of productivity, capitalism, consumerism, and how we even commodify ourselves in a way, like in the
Yes.
dating marketplace, the sexual marketplace, which is just an icky
Oh,
term in
yeah, yeah,
itself,
yeah,
which is sort of another topic. But the frame, really understanding what a frame is, how to reframe, things can be very transformative, I think, in terms of personal development.
yeah.
One of the concepts I've written about is what I call the reflection principle. It's the idea that everything outside of us, every problem that we see is outside of us, is actually just a lesson, something, you know that's reflecting something inside of us that can be healed, or
Mm,
broken through. So that's an example of, frame, shift,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
It's not a problem. It's not this external thing that we're a victim to. It's actually something that is opening up a new inner experience. And that is how in my belief system, that we become kind of anti-fragile. Are you familiar with that term, Nassim
Yes, I
Taleb?
am. I am.
Yeah, so that's
Um,
that for me is part of the spiritual process, and that's fundamental to the emergence theory work. It's like, okay, when these principles are in place, then there's this anti-fragile self that emerges.
yes.
That where we benefit from stress, from disruption.
So there seems to be a huge component of what you mean by spiritual, that is this kind of Socratic self-knowledge, not our autobiography or our story, but our understanding of, the machinery of the psyche, and what is proper to us and what has been imposed on us. There's that kind of profound self-knowing that's going on. And then there's also the cultivation of this anti-fragility, this deep adaptivity component. So are those essential features in your idea of what spiritual means?
Yeah, I think anti-fragility is, a function of death and rebirth. And I think death and rebirth is essentially spiritual, the letting go of the ego, the letting go of the ordinary
Ah,
mind and
oh, okay. So
consciousness.
that's an
Yeah.
important component too. So there's
Mhm.
there's a kind of Socratic self-knowing. There's the building of the anti-fragility, and those are bound up with these processes of ego death and rebirth, which are much more fundamental to the very structure of the psyche, and how it's unfolding. Is
Mhm.
that, am I getting the dimensions right?
Yeah, I think so. If I understand it.
Well, we'll get to your framework in a bit, but I still want to ask one more question first, which is another term that you invoke, and it sounds like it touches on those three dimensions. That's why I asked that question, which is this notion of intuition. And this is a notion that's extremely equivocal in our society and runs all over the place and does all kinds of good work and also all kinds of nasty work. So what do you mean by it, and how does it align with everything else you've been talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's so hard to define. But it's almost so there's a way to think about it by what it's not.
Okay.
I think that, intuition, the way that I define it, is kind of the inner knowing, the bodily wisdom,
Mm,
the part of us that just knows, that doesn't actually make sense to the conscious mind. And
mm,
so, as we spoke about previously, there's a relationship between the metacognition and the intuition that both need each other. And some
yes,
people are way too metacognitive, they're too cerebral, rational in a way that alienates them from their bodies and their somatic
yes,
interoception.
yeah,
And then there's people who are so intuitive to a point that it's completely unchecked, and they become, they have
grandiose.
hubris and
Yeah,
grandiose, and they're
yeah,
God and they know everything.
yeah.
And that's unhealthy too. So we have this dialectic, right?
Ah,
In the framework we've talked about, um, between metacognition and intuition. And so I guess that's one part of it. Going back to what I was saying about by what it's not, I think it's also really helpful to say intuition is not impulse, right?
yeah,
Like an impulse is also a bodily sensation, but
yeah.
there's a way that we can kind of extricate that and go, okay, wait, an intuition, or I'm sorry, an impulse is urgent. There's anxiety.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
that's where the metacognitive comes in. It's like, wait, is this an impulse or is this actually my inner wisdom? And I
Mhm.
think you just qualitatively, if you have that awareness to discern those things, I think it's pretty obvious when you're being impulsive versus when you're being wise and grounded in your inner knowing. And I think it's actually not that hard to discern between your head and your heart, or your metacognitive and your intuitive, if you're just conceptualizing it that way. The way that I see most people engaging with their inner life is they put their, and this is my personal experience too, which is why I've been able to suss it out, I guess. It's like they put their head and their heart, their intuition and their metacognition on the same plane, and they just go, oh, I'm conflicted and there's these different parts of me, but they don't actually have a sense of which is which and which actually should be in charge. And according to Ian McGilchrist's work in The Master of and His Emissary, and my understanding and work in this, personal transformation work for, over a decade, is that actually the metacognitive is supposed to be secondary to the
Mhm.
intuitive.
Mhm.
The right brain is supposed to really be in charge. The more intuitive, the less cerebral, the more sensing, knowing. And the metacognitive is a checks and balance. It's supposed to be subservient, or in service of, is a better way to say it. And
Mm,
so in my belief, we have, I think that simply being able to say, this one is what my mind is saying, and this one is what my intuition is saying, and kind of knowing and trusting that within certain boundaries, that our intuition is actually, the thing that we should be listening to, as long as there's not anything, if your intuition is telling you to jump off a cliff, obviously that's where your metacognitive goes, no.
yeah.
Not, which people experience on psychedelics, right? So
Yes,
like
yes,
that's why we need that part of us, that can keep us in check when we're feeling really connected to an intuition that might not be so wise.
So how does your notion of intuition sit with respect to, what I talk about different kinds of knowing, and I talk about the non-propositional knowing, the procedural, the perspective,
Right.
the participatory, and that it has this self-organization dynamic. It shows up in insight and transframing. How,
Right.
how close is your notion of
Oh,
intuition to
that's
the
interesting. Yeah,
non-propositional?
I hadn't mapped those things onto each other. So participatory is a way that I would think about it. Like
Yeah.
there's a relationship, there's a dance that
Mm,
we that of intuition, of honing intuition,
right.
and because it's like intuition is forged in the process of testing of we listen to our intuition, we try something out, and then we get the data and we integrate the
Yes,
data,
yes,
and
yes, yes,
that's a very participatory process.
yes.
um Procedural, is it procedural and perspectival? You'd have to sort of remind me of those terms.
Well, the
I do.
procedural is your knowing how, your skills,
Oh,
your virtuosity in the world. Your
right.
perspective is your salience landscaping, how you're framing things, right? Basically.
Yeah, it sounds like there are elements of all of those kinds of knowing in
Yeah,
my definition of intuition.
sounds like it to me too. That's why I wanted to ask you that question. That's very interesting. That's very powerful. Do do many people you do work with, are they in some way, and don't, I'm not asking you to
I
pigeonhole.
won't, I won't, I won't betray any confidentiality. Don't
No,
worry.
no, but I also don't. Yeah, yeah. But I also don't. I also want to, like. I want to. I want you to feel open to answers. That's basically what I'm saying.
Mm.
Does the issue of meaning, or in the sense of, that I talk about it in the meaning crisis, come up in your work a lot?
I think implicitly
Yeah,
it's the thing,
it's the
even if
thing,
it's not,
right?
if even if it's not explicit or the client's not aware. I
Yeah.
mean, the healing process is meaningful, right?
Yes.
It's a hero's journey, right? This is an aside to your question, I'm sorry to interject, but I
No.
heard this thing and I don't know why, it just delights me. We know the hero's journey. You confront the thing that terrifies you, the dragon.
Yeah.
You find your way home. It's a new home, is a new place. But there's the idea of the warrior archetype, is
Yes.
it's the person who, it's not just one journey and okay, now we're done. It's
Yeah.
this continual encounter with what we fear. And so
Yeah.
I guess that for me, I guess when I think about anti-fragility, when I think about, you know, um, transformation, when I think about, really our intuitive knowing and how that helps us navigate the world, and integrity and character, it's like there we have to really, it's a process of, endless encounters with what terrifies us, and that requires us to kind of embody this warrior archetype in a way. So I'm getting off topic here,
No,
but
no, not really. I think
just
that's on
love
topic.
that.
And I've had discussions with both Anderson Todd and Rafe Kelly around this, and Jordan Peterson's sort of appropriation of the hero archetype and the warrior.
Yeah,
Uh,
I would love to have some conversations with him about about that,
so
courage conceptualization.
yeah, because I want to say something to you, and I want to see how this lands with you. Because I've criticized Jordan uh, for having a one-sided appraisal of Greek mythology, because for every hero myth, there's a hubris myth
Exactly.
where human beings go beyond their finite transcendence and try to become the gods, and then
And
they get,
their wax wings melt as they
yeah,
get too close to the sun. Absolutely. And I was a huge fan of Jordan's for years. in some ways idolized him, and then I really had a fall from grace, and I still think there's a lot of power in his work. And
Yeah.
but gosh, I actually, through when I was really listening to his work a lot, what I found was that I would traumatize myself because I would face things at a pace that I wasn't psychologically prepared
Yes.
to. So I would
Yeah.
just, okay, face the dragon, like, go into the cave and, die and be reborn. I was like, yeah, that's all true. But like, also you have to, the intuition piece is like, you have to know when you're really, the difference between being at how do I say this? The difference between going out of your comfort zone and facing your fear and actually going past an inner limit of what you can face. Like, it reminds me of a friend of mine who's very high metacognitive and alienated from his body, ran a marathon without training, and then, but was so, I've got this and I'm mind over matter, that he ended up, passing out at mile 11 because he didn't, and he had a seizure and he had to be taken to the,
Yes.
picked up by an ambulance. It's
Yes.
like, when you don't honor your own limitations, it's there's not that's not courage, that's hubris, as you
Yeah.
say. And so I find that while Jordan's work is very inspiring in many ways, and I think it's speaking to one side of the dialectic that my framework talks about, which is the
Yeah.
courage limitations dialectic in my framing. And it's like, if and that's really helpful for people when they need that push. But if they don't actually learn the,
Yeah.
counterpart of when to honor your limitations, it can be extremely destructive as well. So I think that's why I think there are so many frameworks that, or people's works, or systems of thinking that resonate with people, but they only speak to one side of the truth.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that side of the truth is really powerful and meaningful. But if it's not in context, I think it can make us sick. If anything that doesn't have the whole, both counterparts, or the whole dialectic, I think is really dangerous.
Yeah, I'm really profoundly influenced by, well, the Platonic dialectic, and the Platonic sense of dialectic, and Drew Hyland's book, Finitude and Transcendence. Plato's whole philosophy is to try to give us a stereoscopic reminding that we are always finite transcendence. If we just
Mm,
emphasize the finitude, we can fall into despair, servitude, right?
right.
But if we just emphasize the transcendence, we can fall into
Mm,
hubris, inflation, megalomania. And what we have to do is constantly pursue the way in which the two are always wedded together, mutually acting as checks and balances on each other.
right. Yeah, and it reminds me of Ken Wilber's work with No Boundaries, where he talks about all these things that we see as opposites or counterparts, but also that there's no real lines in the world, that
Yeah.
actually we can, we have there's lines in like a visual sense, but there's not actually any boundaries between things. Everything is actually, we could say they're separate, or we could say they're touching, or they're
Mhm.
connected, and they're not separable in a way. Like, the lines are also where things touch as much as where things. So that's a frame, as well. But I kind of got off topic. What was the stereoscopic and the integration? Yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not familiar with Plato's dialectics. So that's interesting. I was exposed to Hegel, the dialecticism.
Yeah. Hegel's
Not into it.
dialectic is a truncated version. It's
Okay,
a,
well, for
yeah.
me and my limited knowledge, it's been so that's kind of how I see the
Sure.
character formation process is: thesis, antithesis, synthesis, new thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's like that process we were talking about gathering data and refining your character, and trusting your intuition. That feels to me like the process that we as individuals,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
go through, as well as societal movements. So I
Yeah.
like that framework, even if
No,
it's maybe
I,
limited.
Hegel's brilliant. I mean, there's a dangerous Promethean spirit within Hegel's philosophy, but Hegel's brilliant. I don't deny it. And that dialectical notion, and the fact that it's bound up with logic, for me, I don't want to get into a deep think about Hegel, but the Hegelian dialectic leaves out all of the non-propositional that was in the Platonic dialectic, and
Interesting. I'll
very
have to study
important.
that more.
Well, the way you can study it is when my new series comes out after Socrates. Shameless plug, shameless plug. And, and so it's coming out very soon.
What's it called
Um,
again?
After Socrates,
Wonderful.
it's the whole project of tracing out the whole Socratic tradition of developing this this virtue called dialectic that leads you into a process of dialogos and what that looks
Ooh.
like. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
this sounds like my kind of
I
jam.
think you'll think you'll like it, but like we won't get too distracted from that by that, because I want to give you a chance to talk about your framework, which you also shared with me off camera, and which I found insightful and thought provoking. And I want to. Do you need to share screen or anything, or?
Oh, it might be helpful to, I think. It's such a visual model. It's a little bit hard to talk about without actually seeing the model.
By the
And
way, which is evidence of the power of perspectival knowing.
oh, let's see if I can
You should
share
be able
my
to share
screen
screen
and
now.
pull this up. Let's see. Let me pull it up and then, oh, where are you? There. I don't see this share screen. There we go. I think I made my window a little bit smaller and then
Coming up now.
away.
Coming
There
up
we
now.
go.
Yep, there you are.
Okay. So this is the overall model over here, but it breaks down into smaller matrices. So we have these different domains of coherence, where I break down the principles of each down here,
Right.
but they kind of intersect and overlap. So coherence is, I define coherence as integrity, balance, and wholeness. And there are four
Yes.
domains in which we kind of outline those principles for missional, behavioral, self, and relational. And then where those overlap, there's this kind of these emergent states, these more spiritual, or
Mm,
anti-fragile things that kind of just naturally arise from the principles of coherence. And then where those overlap and intersect, the societal, spiritual, and collective actualization occurs. So, not to get, too deep into the weeds on any of this, but what I've tried to do as much as possible, and I think for the most part, other than missional, this I've achieved this, but it's, like everything, it's an iterative process. So I'm constantly changing and tweaking it.
yeah.
Even last night in anticipation of this, I was like, oh no, that's a better dialectic, this polarity mutuality,
Yeah.
so let's start with self though. So, we've talked a lot today about, self, these concepts in self-coherence, which are metacognition and intuition, that dialectic, and then the
Yeah.
courage and limitations. And
Yep.
then where these things overlap and intersect, we see that, where courage and metacognition intersect, we have self-awareness. Where metacognition and limitations intersect, we have humility.
Yes.
And you can kind of see this,
Yep.
self-trust being a part of a function of
Yep.
courage and intuition. And then surrender,
Yep.
that kind of honoring our limitations in the intuition um, piece. And then kind of how those stack our resiliency and empowerment. So then these inner circles, kind of, where the, let's go back here, where the self and relational intersect, we have the relational emergence. And then these two inner circles of resiliency, empowerment, love, and trust become the outer circles for relational emergence. And then we see kind of
Ah,
how those kind of stack and what emerges from those principles. But going back to the you know the coherence piece, the relational dialectics are, well, so we talked about the metacognition, the courage limitations quite a bit, so I don't think we need to belabor that too much, but I've sort of tried to do the same thing with the relational piece. It's like openness and boundaries are sort of the relational version in a
yeah.
way of courage and limitations, right?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
So, we all know those people who don't have any boundaries and they're so open to a fault in a
Yes.
way
Yeah.
that doesn't feel safe. And then we know people who are so bounded
The
that,
wall. Yeah.
there's a wall, right? And so there's this dialectic there that we have to feel into with our, intuition and inner knowing, and, iteratively learn kind of where those healthy lines are. And then, on the sides, there's a mutuality and polarity. So there's a way in which we want this equal investment and equality, but then it's really boring when you have when people who are exactly like you, like in
Yes.
my experience, like the energy just doesn't, quite,
Yeah.
there's nothing dynamic in it. And so there's this balance and dialectic between polarity and mutuality. And then we kind of see how these things stack to curiosity, depth,
Mm,
growth, polarity and boundaries, growth, right? Like when you have a partner and you have this polarity and you have these differences, and it kind of forces you to
right.
grow beyond what you're ordinarily capable of. And that's part of the magic and the, transformational process of partnership. So you can kind of see how these things overlap, and how they stack down to emergence, and then, all the way down to the spiritual and societal. So it's such a, complex model. I don't feel the need to get into every single detail, but what questions, or, do you have, or what would you like me to address or
Well,
go over?
first of all, I want to do a little bit more. So you've got self-coherence, relational coherence, missional coherence, and behavioral coherence. And then is there a meta coherence of all the coherences? Is that what it comes?
So I would say that this is is there a meta coherence? I guess I would say that the emergence is maybe, I don't know if I understand your question.
Well, so if you go down to the next thing, each one of these is between like you're not claiming that metacognition and openness are identical. They have a similar functional place, but they're not exactly the same process, right?
Correct.
So these don't just all merge into each other. When you get sort of when you get a proper coherence within the self, within relations, within your mission, and with your behaviorance, does that give you a broader kind of overall coherence in
Yes,
your
well,
life?
that's what this maps. So it's like
Right.
where these stack, we have emergence, and then where they all stack together, the society and the collective actually have this emergent state.
I
So
see.
so I've given them different terms. That's meta coherence is an interesting one, because I'm always playing with the language and seeing what kind of would resonate the most. So I'm like, oh, maybe that's a new one. They have to change it to the whole theory's name.
Well, the one thing, I mean, the two go together. The thing about meta coherence is it implies there's a nonlinearity, that it's not just adding the four coherences together. It moves you into a higher dimensionality of coherence.
I
And that's, I
see.
think, what you're trying to point to also with the notion of emergence, that you
Yeah.
get the dimensionality of people's um the scope of their life and their scope for appreciating an appropriate response to their life is going up, but it's not going up in a simply linear fashion. It's going up in a non-linear fashion.
Yeah,
Is
I
that
love
land?
that. I think
Okay,
that's right.
okay.
And I think that I've been sort of playing with, and not in any significant degree, but even like, what is temporal coherence?
Yes. Yeah.
Because there's this idea of, in meditation, of being so present. And I think um it can be a very deracinated present where it's like you're just in the
Yeah,
moment.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's the culture of at least many approaches to Western meditation, or Western bastardization of Eastern meditation, probably, what
That's
better said.
exactly what it is. That's exactly that whole McMindfulness thing. I published on this,
Make
right?
mindfulness.
It's the reduction, right, of something
Yeah.
multi,
So
right? It's like the point of mindfulness is not to make you accepting of being a corporate drone. That is not the point of mindfulness, right? That is not what it's about, right?
Oh
Yeah.
God, that's so well said. Yeah, and well, it's also not about only being in the present, because part
No,
of being in the
no.
present is being awake to our past and awake to our future. So
Yes.
a true, like there's I think of it like a symphony, or like a chord, where
Yes.
you're actually experiencing the full dimensionality of time and of the human experience and of vitality, when you're connected with, past, present, and future, all out, when you can hold all those things at once. And I think that is a skill, that is a muscle, it's that has to be built and flexed, and it's practiced, because we're gripped by the past in ways,
Yes.
and we're
Yes.
we're addicted to the future in some ways. But the kind of maybe optimal state is, how am I in right relation to past, present, and future, to the extent that I can. And there are times when we want to be a little bit more over here or over there,
Totally.
and that's
Totally.
that's part of the dance, and the
Yep.
calibrating, and that intuitive knowing of, oh, now is the time. But the overall picture, I think, needs to be balanced to have an optimal experience, I suppose.
Sati means reminding, which
Mm.
already has a sense of
Oh,
the past
interesting.
and making you prescient of what's coming to you from the future. It doesn't mean just dwelling in the present like a cabbage. It means, right? So I I've argued with like my co-authors like Leo Ferraro and others, because I recently published on this in the amazing Rick Rapetti's. Like I just love Rick's work. That's why I was calling the amazing Rick Rapetti. But he edited the Routledge Handbook on the Philosophy of Meditation, and I was actually arguing about this. That's why it's so present to me right now. Right? I think of mindfulness as frame awareness that allows us to get an optimal grip on our temporal experience. That's as also as an optimal grip on our spatial experience, an optimal grip on our social experience, a frame awareness that knows, like, so your frames are always translucent to you because you can't be frameless, but right, oh,
Yes.
is this the right frame now?
Right.
Mindfulness is the skill that allows you to ask that question and answer it well. Is this the right frame now? That takes you out of McMindfulness and all the ways in which it's been bastardized.
That's so interesting. And that, I wonder if, for me, how related my definition of metacognition is to your definition of mindfulness.
They sound very similar.
Right. Yeah. Or maybe it's the dialectic between metacognition and intuition that is your definition of mindfulness.
Could be. I'd have to think about that, but there's an important conversation to be had there, so we'll have to talk again.
I would love that. Well, you're going to be on my show in a few weeks when I get back from my retreat.
I'm looking forward to it. Yeah. So yeah, that reminds me, I've got to get this one out in priority. We'll talk about this later about when to release this one so it optimally sets up when I'm on your channel.
Wonderful.
Well, I mean, part of my work is to, sorry, I hope, I'm not seeing you all of a sudden, Brooke.
Oh, can you see me?
Not yet.
Let's see. What? I just stopped my screen share.
Yeah.
Can you see me now?
I can see you, but I still see your screen.
Let's see. I tried to stop the share. Can you stop the share for me? Why can't I?
You just go to the green box.
There we go. There we go.
There you go. Now you got it.
Can you see me? Now I can't see
now
you.
Now you're fine.
There we go. There we go. Sorry about that.
That's fine. What was I going to say before that happened? I'm just trying to recover my momentum.
We were talking about, sorry.
Yeah.
We were talking about mindfulness, metacognition, intuition, this ability to.
Yeah. Now I know. Now I know. Now I know. Thank you for that. Where does wisdom sit in this framework?
It's one of the emergent properties of.
Yeah.
I'd have to pull it up again to remember exactly where it sits. If you'd like, I can. But I think it's one of the emergent. I mean, it stems naturally from this integrity, balance, and wholeness, right?
Yes. Yeah.
It's just inevitable. And that's the idea of emergence. It's like, it's just the inevitable byproduct. It organically happens. It's not something that's forced. It's just, this is a really interesting conversation I'd like to have with you is, I've been thinking a lot about, emergence in the sense of what are the conditions that naturally, organically just produce these kinds of states of consciousness, right?
Right. So part of it, and this is why I wanted to move back towards more of a Platonic dialectic than Hegelian, because you get emergence when a system is properly complexifying through self-organization, when it is simultaneously in parallel differentiating and integrating so that it gets capable of doing more things in a coordinated manner that does not rip its agencies apart. And so when you see the brain doing this in relevance realization, and I think relevance realization is actually the closest thing to your notion of intuition, by the way. So maybe we'll come back to that at some point. But because it's always doing the toggling for the optimal grip. But when a system is complexifying, so relevance realization is a system where the brain is constantly integrating, assimilating, differentiating, accommodating, and it's constantly complexifying, like the way my hand is a complex thing. It's highly differentiated and highly integrated. That's why I get dexterity, the right-handedness of the right things on the eightfold path, right understanding. It's not moral righteousness, it's right-handedness. It's that kind of dexterity and capacity for constantly adjusting your grip on things, right? It's adaptive gripping. And so a system will generate emergence if it is complexifying. You see this in biological systems. We all started out as zygotes. Our cells differentiated, but then they also self-organized, listen to the word, self-organized into lungs and eye and heart. So the system is constantly differentiating, but also increasing its integration at the same time. And then that gives you the emergence of new kinds of functions. And that's how you get qualitative development over and above just quantitative development.
Yes, I remember learning about emergent properties back in my neuroscience days at
Yeah,
USC. And my professor talked about consciousness as an emergent property of, neural network and
yeah,
neurochemistry. And for me, it was just like, what scientists call emergent properties. It's just like the magic and the wonder and the spiritual. I mean, it's like the stuff that we don't have language for, that um is inexplicable. Like consciousness is not the thing you would expect to get from complex neural circuitry, right? Like the qualitative experience of consciousness, from my perspective, it's such a mystery, right? And so emergence is just so fascinating to me from that perspective. But kind of getting back to, for me, what's really interesting is a practical, what are the conditions that allow us to have these transformative spiritual experiences that create the most meaning and purpose and ultimately impact in our lives? Because there's a way in which this self, the thing that's so icky about the new age movement is it's so self-indulgent and self-focused,
yes,
and it's
yes, I
all about
agree.
me, and there's something so incomplete about that. And that's why my kind of notion of missional coherence is really about, like, what does the world need? It's like a little bit, it's very similar to ikigai, right? It's like, what does the world need, and how does that intersect with my skills, gifts, and passions?
Exactly,
and
exactly.
and and that's, like, for me, that's the concept of dharma. It's like, I'm incomplete if I don't actually manifest my personal destiny in the world in service of the world, and the world is incomplete when individuals do not, actualize that. So there's a complementarity between the, our self-actualization. This is what Scott Barry Kaufman talks about with, Maslow's work, is,
Yeah,
there's an incomplete self-actualization without the actual impact and service to the world.
right. Wow, so many things sparking. Quick thing on Maslow, very few people know because he didn't publish much about it. He had a stage beyond self-actualization of self-transcendence, which was supposed to be about that. He rips up, he didn't rip off, but most of what's in Maslow basically comes from the Neo-Platonic framework and how it integrates Plato and Aristotle. So just that. Second thing, that that I call that transjectivity. That's the core of 4E cognitive science. That the mind isn't in it here and the world out there. They're looping into and through each other continuously, and that's how we have to understand the mind. I think
Mm.
that is a really central and important thing. And the best Greek word for translating dharma is logos, and that's what's in dialogos. Dialogos is the sati, the individual and collective shared reciprocal flowing mindfulness, so that we can remember the Dharma, we can remember the logos and let it move us again. And that's not in the Hegelian dialectic. And that's something I'm.
That is where I think Jordan Peterson gets it really right when he talks about logos in his debate with Sam Harris. It is like a masterpiece how he
Yeah,
talks about
yeah,
logos, the self-organizing.
yeah.
I haven't heard him talk about it in a while, but it's that spirit of what is both emergent and organizing
Yes,
that he
yes.
described, just beautifully earlier. Yes. Oh, this is so wonderful. I feel like there's so many different points to touch.
Well, I think maybe what we should do, and I don't mean to be overly coy, but let's draw to a close for you and I, and on my channel, and then we'll pick up with that momentum on your channel.
Oh, okay. Well, this has been just such a delight, such an honor. I'm really, you're just a hero of mine, and just being invited to your show is a real, really humbling and a real honor and privilege. So thank you for sharing this time.
It's been wonderful, Brooke. I'm like on fire right now. This
Me too. I'm
conversation.
so sad
Yeah,
that we're
yeah, yeah,
wrapping
yeah,
up.
yeah.
I'm like, let's keep going. But we'll keep the momentum going on the next show. It's too bad that I'm traveling for a few weeks and we can't do it sooner.
That's okay. I'll watch this again. Maybe you can watch it again. I'll send you the file, and then we can get. I don't doubt that we'll be able to get back into this very quickly.
I don't
Um,
either.
I like to give my guests the final word. It doesn't have to be summative or cumulative. It can be whatever you want, but it can be those things if you want it to be, but it can be other than those if you also want it to be. Just, anything you want to leave the listeners, the viewers with as your final sort of parting word.
Well, my shameless self-plug part wants to say a couple things about my new podcast, just that
Please,
if you don't
please.
mind, just
Yeah.
it's brand new, so I'm just trying to get the word out. It's called On Living with Brooke Sprowl, and really trying to do similar things that just awaken higher consciousness, spiritual awareness, tools for self-transformation, and really how that parlays into transforming society and the world. Really, how do we change our collective agreements about inequity, poverty,
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
bigger issues? How does that intersect with the
Yeah.
work? How
Yeah.
can we start to really make the individual and the collective one, because they are one? And so that's really my mission, and my goal is to really expand my reach and our reach, and in these conversations of cultivating meaning, cultivating transformation, spiritual consciousness, and then ultimately global transformation, and changing systems. Because you know I used to think that issues like global hunger were logistical issues, and they're
Mm.
not. They're spiritual issues,
Yes.
because we
Yes.
have I'm so glad that you resonate with that. We have the infrastructure, technology, and resources to feed everyone on the planet, and to
Mm.
to do anything we need to do to correct, not perfectly for inequity, but like much to a very significant degree in which nobody needs to be suffering in the ways that they are. And we've been conditioned and taught to believe that um, you know our that these are logistical problems and they're insurmountable, and that's part of just perpetuating the systems of power that exist. So for me, really adding that piece to the conversation is what gives me the motivation to really expand my platform, my reach, my motivation beyond just my own, whatever my own motives are for, is really about changing the world in some ways. So if people resonate with that, our show's brand new. We just have a few episodes, but it's called On Living with Brooke Sprowl. We'll have John on the show, so that would be amazing. And then from a more, uh, you know, less self promotional piece, I think that what I would like to leave people with is that there is a there, and
Hmm.
if people are listening, they probably already know that, um, but that there is a there, and that really learning to trust your intuition, again with that healthy metacognitive, and what the, and in the spirit of limitations and courage, but like to really know that the voice in your mind is not actually the one that most of the time you should be making your decisions from. I think that has been one of the most healing and transformative lessons of my life. And so I think that's a really good place to start for people who are trying to build the foundational skills to develop this kind of consciousness.
That's an excellent word to end on. Thank you so much, Brooke. Great pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you, John.